Hey, it's Douglas here. We don't often do this, but this week's news requires us to record an emergency intro to the intro. You see, our AMA episode this week talks about Elon Musk and Twitter, which was recorded way back when Elon was only thinking of joining Twitter's board, before he punted on that due to issues with his tweets, free speech, financial disclosures, whatever. And just this morning, it's been announced that he's filed an offer with the SEC to buy out Twitter for about $43 billion. In a letter sent to Twitter, Musk writes that Twitter must go private to make necessary changes. Quote, I invested in Twitter as I believe in its potential to be the platform for free speech around the globe, and I believe free speech is a societal imperative for a functioning democracy. Twitter has extraordinary potential. I will unlock it. On this AMA, we talk a lot about Musk's interests in a role with Twitter and the dangers of troll capital. With today's announcements, I don't think much changes, but the questions and concerns are simply exacerbated. Who knows what will happen next, but Twitter's board has to look at the offer, and well, if you hear me referencing my fire LinkedIn posts in future episodes, you'll know why. All right, to the AMA.
It's dark humor about my gender. I'm allowed to have it. Chill.
Hello, and welcome to the BetaKit podcast. I'm Katie Lohr, producer for the show, and the reason I'm in the hosting seat today is because we are doing another AMA. So, Douglas, Rob, thanks so much for joining me on your show.
I'm so happy to be contractually obligated to do another AMA episode every month because our listeners want a fiddle battle with the devil in a cornfield in Tennessee at the crossroads of my life.
And we are joined by a wonderful guest, Meagan Simpson, BetaKit's associate editor. Welcome to the party, Meagan.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I don't really know how to follow what Douglas just put out there, but I'm happy to be here.
2 AMAs in a row as well, back to back.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a ton of really great questions to get through. They were submitted by listeners, BetaKit readers, and even some that I know, Douglas and Rob, that you guys came up with together and wanted to get into. So let's get into it. Rob, I know you had a question right off the bat, so I'm just going to throw it right over to you.
What? Hosts are submitting questions now? Who does this guy think he is? He goes down to Florida?
Well, it struck me just because I was scrolling the BetaKit today, and I saw the feature article on female entrepreneurs raising capital with Marie from Sampler. And this is a topic that's come up over the many years of this iteration of the podcast and previous iterations of the podcast. We know that female entrepreneurs raise less capital. We know that it takes them longer to raise capital. We knew that when we started the Black Swan episodes, we found that a lot of females were being taken out of the ecosystem entirely, losing to men in the household just to go back and do householdy things. This article, we're recording this on the 5th of April. The article came out on the 5th of April, and I was wondering if you could unpack it because it was pretty dense and it's pretty relevant to do a pulse check. We're sort of in the new normal. What the fuck is happening with female entrepreneurship?
That is such an easy question. Let me just answer it for you. No problem. And I think this can apply generally to the way things have changed for how people of different genders, specifically, women, are kind of treated generally. I think there's obviously been movement. You're seeing funds like Stand-Up Ventures, the 51, all kinds of
Backbone.
Yeah, thank you. There are more I could go on and name, right? But you're seeing more and more people realizing the opportunity there is to invest in women because there's so much money to go in there. There's data out there that shows that women-run companies are more diverse, have better returns. These are things that are there. And so you're seeing funds that are saying, oh, there's an opportunity here. I'm going to jump in. But at the same time as you see a movement, whether it's in entrepreneurship, getting investing, or on just the political front or just the everyday lives of women, there's still shit that we face all the time.
Well, that's a troubling thing, right? The VCs you list, Stand Up is Michelle investing in women, the 51 investing in women. It's their thesis is to invest in women, but that's kind of fucked to if the other statistics are true, because then why aren't other heterogeneous VCs doing it. It's almost like they're doing it for a mission, as opposed to like, no, actually female entrepreneurs are as good or better than male entrepreneurs, independent of who invests in them. Isn't that, it's kind of disturbing that the VCs have to be like mission driven.
It is. And you know what's interesting is Marie of Sampler in the article itself. And when I was speaking to her, she was like, yeah, I've been able to grow and scale my business. I've got great backing of founders, but I have kind of three buckets. I've got angel investors. I've got, strategic investors that are interested in my kind of sampling business. And then I've got investors that are focused on women. And she's like, while it's great and she loves to see it, she says the fact that so many women startups in Canada are backed by specifically women-led funds, it still points to an issue, right? And I think she makes a very good point.
Well, not also, I think in the story, it's noting the other larger institutionals who are either saying we only see 2 out of 100 women applicants at later stages, or acknowledging through their own process, realizing that they will hear a pitch from a man and a woman for essentially the same company and be really excited about the male-led pitch, even though there's a woman-led company with essentially the same pitch that's not receiving that traction, right? That's a real heat check moment for one of Canada's most active funds in the later stages.
Well, also you said in the article, if I'm not mistaken, that like Marie was asked a question of a VC, and then the financing question they asked her, not of the founder, but of their head of product, who was male, sitting at the table.
Yeah, Meagan, do you want to even like just describe the process of maybe like the kind of the outcome of the report, and then what prompted you to want to speak to Marie from Sampler related to the story, like how we kind of connected those two dots together?
Yeah, when the report came out, it was kind of interesting to see what had been shared. Because like you said, Rob, off the top, we know that it takes longer for women to raise capital. They tend to raise less capital, different approaches, different networks. We know this. These are not new things, right? But I think what was really interesting about this report is the fact that there was also kind of this like qualitative, like people, men, women, people in the tech ecosystem talking to their experiences, what they've experienced, their bias, whatever it was. The Conference Board of Canada, it was their survey, and they also hosted a bit of an event last week where Marie, as well as some of the other investors and people noted in the article, were speaking. And so I noticed that Marie was there and thought, you know what, let's just reach out and see if she's willing to share her stories. And honestly, I'm very not necessarily hesitant to reach out, but I've kind of mentioned, if you saw my tweet thread about this, is I've had tons of people come up to me in Canadian tech ever since I've been working at BetaKit all these past years, telling me about experiences that they've had with people in the ecosystem, but they're never going to share it on the record. They're never going to name names because it's so small in Canadian tech, and they're worried about what people are going to think, right? And how it's going to affect their business or raising money. And so when I reached out to Maria, I wasn't sure if she'd be willing to kind of share her stories. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that she was. When the report came out, really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting stories, because that's what the report from Conference Board was doing, right? Highlighting stories, because we've seen the data. It's out there. Here's what people are actually experiencing. I think that's more powerful for people than just ROI is higher if you invest in women, which is true and very, very powerful also, but, power in stories.
Meagan, you're totally right that the missing component here is the stories, and I think having it be associated to individuals and not anonymized. What struck out to me was the willingness for Marie to speak out, in contrast a little bit to the people who are willing to speak out for the report but still have their voices anonymized. Rob noted this question along the framing of when we relaunched the podcast around the pandemic. But I go back earlier to 2016 when 500 startups blew up, and we were obviously speaking about it. The whole tech ecosystem in Canada was speaking about it, and being on a train to Montreal for Startup Fest, a train in which a woman there was sexually harassed on that train to Startup Fest, and then speaking with every woman I know in Canadian tech during that period, and they're personally sharing their stories of similar or worse experiences. Those stories have largely gone unreported in this space because BetaKit is aware of much more than it reports, both because of the hurdles necessary to clear for publication and like libel and just all of our due diligence, but also because of the fear of speaking out, the fear of being cut off from access to capital, the fear of this being a very small community. It's the fear that killed 500 Canada, because the limited pool of LPs in Canadian tech did not want any part of a fund associated with Dave McClure. So that's why I think it's so powerful that someone like Marie Chevrier Schwartz now would be willing to speak openly and publicly about her experiences, because I think it really underscores again some of the voices and the stories that are highlighted in this report that are still anonymous. It puts a personal, tangible face to these things, and I think it's an important next step, and just have to commend her for it, simply because, as she acknowledges in the story itself, a few years prior, she would not have been willing to speak out because it might have impacted her capacity to fund. And now that she's surpassed that, she's using her power to put a spotlight on this. And I just couldn't be more happy that we're a publication that is able to tell some of these stories.
The one thing that I just want to add to this is, obviously we're talking specifically about women entrepreneurs, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that intersectional individuals also face higher challenges, right? If you're a woman of color, the challenges are even greater. If you're in the LGBTQ community, there's lots of challenges, and I'm always happy to tell these stories about women in tech. I hope I get to continue telling stories like these of Marie, but I also did want to acknowledge, that this is just one part of the spectrum. There's so much more out there that happens and needs to change, I think.
I have no follow-up things to say about that because I'm just like, preach, Meagan, preach. So let's get into some submitted questions. First, what are your thoughts on how increasing unaffordability in parts of the country will impact the geography of Canada's tech industry? I am super curious to hear what you guys think.
This is, and I don't do this as a bit, right? The questions are submitted, but we see them beforehand so we can prepare. This is like the easy off the cuff question. This is the palate cleanse after hurdles women in tech face. Like, this is, we're just gonna, the aperitif is housing
punch you in the
crisis.
gut now. Yeah.
To this person who submitted this over Twitter, thank you. I think the impact has already happened. I'm seeing stories written, both in Toronto-based publications and locally, of my hometown of Sault Ste. Marie complaining about real estate prices doubling, even though they're doubling to about half the price of a two-bedroom house in Toronto. I live surrounded by a variety of homes that are being listed right now for well over $3 million. I don't I don't own the home that I live in around these homes. This is only going to continue. We have broken the municipal density of tech in this country, and there's no going back, because you look at like a province like Quebec, Bonjour Startup Montreal, and I believe Montreal Inc. just merged to form Startup Montreal. And since the pandemic, they've really been trying to figure out their mandate, because half the tech companies in Montreal moved outside of the city, and they were like, is it still part of our mandate to support them now that they don't live in Montreal or live in the burbs or live 2 hours outside? Where is our tech ecosystem and hub and cluster? So the impact is that Canadian tech will no longer be 5 different city-states of tech innovation, because most Canadians can't afford to live in at least 2 of those city-states.
Where can we afford to live, though?
Jesus, Meagan. Decline to comment.
Yeah, I think, like, just to pull on that thread, because I'm sort of aligned with you, Douglas. I think what we've seen with the pandemic, we found this, like when I was at TWG, we would talk to clients and they're like, you need to work on site. And we're like, well, why? Why do we need to work on site with you all the time? Yes, there's collaboration. It does enhance it to an extent, but that doesn't mean we need to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It doesn't make any sense. The pandemic has shown that you kind of don't need to be there. So on the good side, I think we've seen that you can kind of be anywhere you kind of feel like being in Canada. You don't have to pay exorbitant rent or exorbitant fees for houses. And you can actually be a productive member of society as long as you've got high-speed internet. You can work in the innovation economy. However, we're going to see, as the interest rates go up, the housing prices will stagnate to an extent, but they'll still be unaffordable. And then the other downside is we see, Walmart, Facebook, and American startups paying American wages to Canadian talent. That drives up their incomes, that will in turn drive up the cost of being in Canada to begin with. So I think that net, it's only going to go in one direction. I'm totally aligned with you. I think that there is a tolerance now for working in non-traditional locations that may be an out, but it's definitely a policy challenge to figure out how you create not affordable housing always makes it sound you're looking at the people who have the least in our society, the people who are on the outs or newer immigrants or something like that. But affordable housing also applies to the middle class who are being
My
priced
entire
out
generation?
as well. Yeah, exactly. I mean, John Oliver did a thing where he was like talking about housing and something like that. And he's like, to those who are under 35, buying a house is something that you used to be able to do. You'll never be able to do it, but just to explain it to people who will never be in that situation.
And that actually only applies in very specific parts of
Exactly.
the United States, because there are broad swaths where, like, if I wanted to move back to Indiana, I could own multiple homes and kind of become my own little monopoly baron within the state. That's not possible because I couldn't stand to live in the United States anymore. But there is still some regional overlay there, I guess. But Rob, I know that you've it's obviously that you're working on your own startup now, because you said net, and I just want to note that and appreciate it and praise it.
In Canada, for the record.
Okay, on to our next question. We have a question from Senator Deacon, friend of the
Friend
podcast.
of the pod.
Okay, so it's a bit of a lengthy one, but I think it's very interesting. So here we go.
Katie, you're going to shit talk a senator before reading his question?
It's a long question, okay? I'm sorry, Senator Deacon. It's a whole paragraph. We may see an excess profits tax placed on our banks in this week's federal budget. What are your thoughts of the relative value of taxing the excess profits of incumbents in protected sectors like banking versus introducing regulatory reforms that level the competitive playing field for new entrants?
It goes on, and for reference, Senator Colin Deacon, who is a friend of the pod, also shared a commentary that he made on LinkedIn that I think we can link in the show notes, driving in detail, essentially like some sort of analysis that shows that the current Liberal NDP deal almost locks in some sort of implementation of an excess profits tax. He doesn't seem to be for it. I think he would prefer competition in place of some sort of back-ended tax. On this point, I'm generally inclined to agree with him. Not necessarily that competition is the only component here that would, I guess, level the playing field. We've talked a lot about competition on this podcast. We're working on future competition-related episodes. If the senator opened the gates of hell to the conversation about open banking, which would allow us to shit on recent Globe and Mail op-eds if we want to. For me, it's less about, the right mechanism to level the playing field to allow disruptors to compete with incumbents. I see it more as, if you have an excess profits tax, you are attempting to solve a problem on the back end that is not created or started there. And I would be looking as high upstream as possible to eliminate ideas such as excess profits, which also might enable greater competition. But I don't think creating a kiddie slush fund to fuel new startup entrants to compete with incumbents that somehow have too much profit is the way to go. Much in the same way, I don't think that news publishers in Canada getting a little kickback for tech platforms profiting from their control of the internet is the way to facilitate the growth and development of Canada's news ecosystem. I just think you're not even putting your finger in the dike at that point. You are kind of sieving through the water after it destroys the town. I don't know. This is way too far down the road to actually solve any meaningful problem. And we'll get a lot of business people up in arms about tax and spend, and those types of things.
I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a tax policy expert. So just...
Well, lucky we are. It's good that we have Douglas and me on the show who
yeah.
have our CPAs and
yeah, I figured,
have political... Yeah.
leave it to you guys. But no, I think I'm inclined to agree with what Douglas says. But the question that I think every time I come on this for the AMA, I end up asking you guys questions. But the kind of question that popped up to me, Douglas, as you were talking this through, what then works, right? You're talking about this being like something that's like too late. What was it? Finger in the dike? I don't know if that was the analogy you got there. Like, what then does work is kind of the question that popped to my mind to turn around.
Actually, first, just pausing to acknowledge that you are running the same tactic that you did in the last AMA to not answer any of these things, which, I both acknowledge and respect. I also should note, because of the senator, we're breaking the rule that we all established going into this AMA that we weren't going to talk about the budget because we have a budget podcast coming up next week and potentially a competition-focused podcast coming the week following. It's fine. I think this is a scenario where
There's competition, which is a huge problem in Canada on a variety of sectors, not only because it doesn't exist, but there are also, if you read the Globe and Mail, a lot of good reasons for competition to not exist, according to supposed journalists who speak to a lot of bankers. Then there's this excess profits thing, which is causing significant problems in Canada across the board when it comes to inflation and things like that. So I feel like the senator and I are in line in that this doesn't solve the true problems. Now, he's focused on the competition component. I'm more focused on the how do we create a society where there's such a thing as excess profits from the most profitable companies in Canada, and how do we maybe allow that capital to initially flow into the individuals that need it, like those earnings depressed Canadians, those people who are unable to afford a home, all of those specific reasons. So I think I don't have the specific policy in mind. I have a couple things in my head that I would never say on a podcast because, again, not a policy expert. I just don't need the mentions. But I think it's got to be, this is Ben Bergen from CCI on our recent provincial budget conversation finally said something that I thought was really insightful. It's that CCI is focused way less on spending commitments and way more on policy structures and systems because they actually have more longer term, broad reaching impacts. And I feel like an excess profits tax is kind of a corollary to like a $1 billion superclusters program where it's just money tacked on at the end that doesn't really solve problems. And we should be looking at the underlying reasons this imbalance happens in the first place. Competition is a component, but there's a lot of other things related to that excess profit that should be investigated as well.
Tying it into open banking, which is what I think the senator was doing a bit, right, is very interesting because that's a market that has essentially lacked competition. You can think of tons of others, right, in the Canadian space as well, whether it's telecom or whatever. So
yeah, we can let's use that as a great example, right? Because, and this is where I probably call out Rita, I believe Treacher is her last name, her op-ed, but that saying Canada needs a modern privacy law before allowing open banking. Essentially arguing that startups are being, they're just rushing ahead and they're being so pushy for this open banking stuff. And we really need to think about Canadian citizens' privacy before this happens. We don't want to move fast and break things. It was probably the most ill-conceived column in the Globe I've ever seen related to open banking. It's not informed by, I think, conversations with any fintech startup in the space. And nor do I think that most Canadian fintechs are looking for a handout from the banks that they're trying to compete with to allow them to compete. What they actually want is the infrastructure and the regulation to allow them to compete. They want to just compete on merits. They want it easier for them to be considered banks. They want access to real-time rails and payments infrastructure so that they can provide new products and services. And they want to make it really, really easy for customers who are interested in doing so to give them their financial data so that they can provide those things, all of which are currently ostensibly controlled or have the development stymied by our big five banks. So taking a little off the top, a little haircut off the top of some of Canada's most profitable organizations to dump on these startups without allowing them any of the systemic access so they could actually truly compete isn't going to do anything to help. And honestly, it's not anything that I think a Canadian fintech is looking for. They're very happy to just take money from VCs in exchange for equity and then build a compelling product. So on all sides here, I just don't think that I don't think it's solving any problems. I think it is super Band-Aid.
Yeah, I agree. I think it takes on we're all violently agreeing here. I mean, obviously biased. I'm biased now as a startup, not in the financial services space, but, I worked at telco for a while. And I once tried to start an insurance technology company. And I went and did some user interviews, as you're supposed to do. And I learned, I'm like, I wanted to reduce the cost of insurance for consumers by reducing fraud. And when I spoke to the folks in insurance and just did some user interviews, they were like, yeah, we don't care about insurance fraud. I'm like, oh, why would that be? And they're like, well, consumers, we don't make any money on consumers. We make nothing. If you pick up the phone for a consumer, we lost money. So we try not to talk to them. But if we do pick up the phone, or if we do get a loss, what we do is we look at the claims in aggregate and we say, well, looks like there were more claims this year, so they raised the premiums. So the end user, you, me, everyone on this podcast, and everyone listening to this podcast, pays a higher premium. So we pay for the fraud, not the insurance companies. And so this excess profits tax, where do you think the money is going to come from to pay it? It's our bank fees are increased. Their prime rate is different than our prime rate, than the Bank of Canada's prime rate. That will be passed down to their customers. So I think it will literally cost them nothing, not to mention the fact that they're the most successful companies in Canada, the most profitable, notwithstanding companies like Shopify that have made it there. The other thing it is worth noting, in his question, he said protected sectors. He does have an opinion. I'm more inclined to lean into the competition part of the argument because I think that it is asymmetric. In the States, open banking was market-driven. Plaid logged in behind the scenes, or some of those older companies would log in behind the scenes, store your information on their servers, and then present it to whoever needed it. So that was an entirely market-driven thing, where there's other countries like the UK, which were entire regulatory-driven. And I think Canada's trying to do something in the middle, but I think we can decouple. I'm taking a different tack here than I think you, Douglas, in terms of like, you can still be a profitable, even a sickly profitable company. So you don't necessarily have to change the foundations and sort of demonize profits for its own sake. You can have your cake and eat it too here, where you can be like, hold on a second. People can all make money. We don't have to like do some radical redistribution of wealth necessarily. I'm not saying that's wrong or right, but you don't have to upend society. You can just say, hold on a second. If we stop protecting the incumbents in each sector for no particular reason other than some FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
And let's be honest, lobbying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When I was at Bell, the executives would go to the CRTC and the CRTCs would come back to Bell to work for Bell. It was the same human beings, and there was a revolving door back and forth between the two. So they're quite close to those industries. And to be fair, like a lot of us have our investments in those banks because they're so reliable. So it is a self-perpetuating cycle. But at the end of the day, I'm more inclined to lean into where the senator was going, which is I think we need to stop protecting the incumbents. I think we need to expose them to more competition. And I don't think you necessarily have to even subsidize the startups, to your point, Douglas. Just let the entrepreneurs be entrepreneurial, let the innovation happen, and don't force entrepreneurship out of this country. The IP, the people, the talent we desperately need to change the fabric of our economy. Don't make them go to the States because they can't compete in Canada.
The other thing here is that this can also create, and again, we're talking about open banking in the fintech sector because it's the most obvious parallel. Meagan was making the point, obviously this is happening in a bunch of different sectors where the consideration is the same. You got three choices, the red one, the green one, or the blue one when it comes to your, banking, telecom, sports team owner options, whatever. But we're seeing this happen right now in the news publishing space, where there are obvious criticisms and concerns that because the federal government is creating a scenario for news publishers to receive support from the federal government, they are creating a dependency. Beyond all the conflicts of interest, they're creating a financial dependency. I could also see this in terms of not being the most effective solution, actually be a pernicious inhibitor of change, because at some point, as we've seen with shred credits or anything else, these startup companies are going to become dependent upon that source of funding. So how incentivized are they going to be to truly compete versus compete just enough to keep the money coming in? So Senator Deakin, we look forward to have you on the podcast again so you can ask more thoughtful questions. I think we're aligned here. And I got to talk a lot of mess about the Globe op-ed that I thought was underreported and conflicting with the reality of all the work that Meagan and I specifically, and Kelsey Rolfe as well, have done in the financial services space.
Hey, the BetaKit podcast is brought to you this week by Osler, the leading business law firm for startups, high-growth companies, and investors in Canada. Hey, including even BetaKit. The firm has just released its Deal Points report on venture capital financings, an inaugural study of 332 anonymized Canadian venture capital and growth equity financings. Now, the report looks at deals from 2019 to 2021 and provides data and insights for founders, entrepreneurs, investors, and advisors contemplating transactions. So if you want to read the new report, you can check out the Deal Points report on venture capital financings at osler.com. That's OSLER.com. Hey, the BetaKit podcast is also brought to you by Cisco, and Cisco wants you to join them at the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto on May 5th from 2:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time to learn all about how migrating from an on-premise phone system to the cloud is the perfect solution for your business. From easier collaboration to simpler remote work, cloud calling has you covered. At the event, you'll hear from industry experts, and attendees will get a chance to win exciting prizes. So to learn more or to register for the event, go to www.business.bullfrog.net/hockey, and we will see you at the Hockey Hall of Fame in May.
Okay, round 2. So the ultimate question. Do you think of BetaKit as a tech site or a startup site? Put in another way, do you see yourself as covering tech, or do you see yourself as covering new companies? And if the answer is tech, what happens when every company is a tech company? Meagan?
I both love and hate this question.
Meagan, do you think the problem is that during the AMA, we made it too easy for people on Twitter to just show up and ask us questions and expect an answer, that we get stuff like this?
It might be. It very well might be. That is such an interesting question.
Do you think of BetaKit?
No.
Are you aware that we have a website?
Just on a regular basis, like 24/7 and, in my nightmares. I don't think I can decouple the two. Because BetaKit is very much a publication that focuses on startups, specifically because there's a lot of coverage. We've talked a lot about the Globe and Mail on the podcast, but as an example,
Sadly.
they're going to cover really big companies, as are the likes of National Post or Bloomberg or whatever. So BetaKit very specifically was created, and Douglas, you can obviously speak to this more, to focus on startups, but specifically tech startups. To the point of when everything's tech, what happens? I don't know. I think we just give up. I don't know.
It's the world we've been living in. And,
Yeah.
we share an anniversary with a publication, The Verge, and their whole premise was built on the fact that tech was going to eat not only business, but also culture. And their publication's predicated on that. I think some of this, and obviously this is coming from a former journalist who's a friend of the pod, who you might have heard on the last AMA, give you 5 guesses if you listen to that episode, who submitted this question. But it's an important one, right?
Wait, it was Meagan? Sorry.
No.
I submit questions during the AMA.
Yes, it's true. To deflect from answering them. Yeah, this is honestly something that I've thought about quite a bit for a couple of reasons. One, I've worked for tech sites before, so I know the difference. Those are usually consumer-focused publications interested in the tech themselves. BetaKit is not a tech site. I believe that we're a business publication, and we're a business publication that focuses on tech and entrepreneurship, because we don't write about products. We write about businesses. We write about businesses with tech products. We write about businesses that, from the earliest stages to IPO, that are looking to disrupt the sectors that they're in. And we also write about the incumbents that are kind of doing battle with them and how they counteract. As tech ate all business, that expanded what we could potentially cover. And we've done a lot of really interesting things lately feature-wise on that. One story that I want to shout out if you haven't read, as we're recording this, it's a day after iGaming or mobile sports betting basically became super legal across Ontario, and there's like 50 new entrants in it. One of them is The Score, whom a lot of people, 35 and up might remember fondly as the place that actually showed NBA basketball games before the Raptors were cool. Previously, like a media company, sold most of that to Rogers, then became kind of like a mobile sports news app. And then after being acquired, has been really leaning into the sports betting space. We've never really covered
the score that much because we don't write about other media companies. That's not our beat. And we don't write about sports unless I can squeak in like a Raptors mention in whatever story that the team is working on. But with iGaming becoming legal in Ontario and likely to follow suit in other provinces across Canada, suddenly we're talking about this kind of upstart tech company with Canadian roots, owned and operated by a larger New Jersey company that's kind of trying to leverage its Canadian history to compete in what is about to become one of the hottest markets in Canada. Like if you turn on a Raptors game or TV at all, you see two things: crypto ads and mobile sports betting ads. So I think that's a really good example of where we would step into spaces that we normally wouldn't. There's tons of like VR, AR, metaverse type stuff coming out of Vancouver as well. We've talked about on this podcast how a Montreal-based company filmed some incredible footage on the International Space Station. We definitely look to dip our toes into that more broadly, but we're always going to be right in the center of the tension between disruptors and incumbents in Canada, in business and in tech. Whether that's the new hotness or, again, fintech, which is literally the most boring thing in the world. It's literally just the way banking has been done for hundreds of years, but just potentially faster because we use electrons.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. And the way that, we often kind of put it, right, is we're covering Canadian tech and tech from a Canadian perspective. I think that puts it really well. Like tech from a Canadian perspective broadens it up to almost anything. But I have a lot of people ask me, inside and outside Canadian tech when they find out I'm a journalist, oh, what's your beat? And I say, oh, I'm, work for a business publication, BetaKit, if they don't know it, say, and they're outside the space. And I say, well, business. And whereas some journalists will focus on fintech or finance, or some will focus on AI or whatever it might be, I think what's really telling, and I think related to this question, is I cover all kinds of tech, right? I have to be an expert on a whole bunch of different things. My beat is just Canadian tech and what relates to Canadian tech's ecosystem.
Yeah. If you are a company that does something with lasers or robots, particularly robots in space, we might be more inclined to write about that. But honestly, like we talk all the time about how we kind of don't care what sectors the companies we cover are in, because we try to treat each of them on their own terms. And whether we might be personally more excited about health tech or some other sector versus one or the other, we try to give each company, I don't want to say spotlight, but it's its own opportunity to share its story. Because really, again, we're focused on the scaling of that company, the success of the company, who they're competing with, how the space might be changing. And we do that from ag tech to VR to fintech to health tech to everything in between. So it's weird as a tech and startup publication to be like agnostic of the tech, but it's because and I've always been a vertical media publication kind of focused on business. This is just the new business. Katie, should we talk about Elon Musk now? Speaking of business and tech.
Okay, well, I guess the big question is, or the big statement, is that Elon Musk is taking a stake in Twitter. So thoughts, concerns, questions? Tell me everything you think.
Definitely concerns. but just quickly to jump in before getting into it, I think this relates to that idea of the intersection of business and tech. This is the world's richest man, a titan of industry, and the internet's biggest shitposter. And he tweets like he has 20 followers and has also been able to buy his way into Twitter with that power and that financial clout, to the point that they gave him a board seat, as some people are reporting, so that he would actually not take over control of the company. There are specific terms to his board directorship that would limit his capacity to influence the direction of the company or take over a larger stake. This shows how much, and we could be talking about crypto bros, we could talk about like meme stocks, any past example of the tech attitude, the tech approach, tech culture, infusing all elements of society to the point that like traditional norms of standards are broken down, including tech companies themselves, who are now having to deal with the most powerful business shitposter tweeting polls saying, do you want an edit button on Twitter? Yes, no. And the company who just, 4 days later on April 1st, were tweeting out April Fools, saying they're working on an edit button feature, coming back around and being like, actually, we've been working on this for the last year and we're super excited, Elon, for you to take an activist investor stake in the company to the point where we gave you a board seat to calm you down. Like this is where maybe that initial question that I answered with such confidence related to our coverage gets really messy because there are no firm walls between any aspect of society anymore. It saddens me because I don't think trolls should run the world. I definitely don't think they should run my favorite/least favorite app, even if that troll's trying to go to Mars.
If Elon Musk did this, why the fuck didn't Donald Trump do this?
Oh God! Don't even put that idea out there, Rob. I'm sorry.
I'm just
my
shocked
God.
that he didn't think about that. But it just proves that he's actually not a business person.
To move on from Rob's actual darkest timeline scenario, I did two things. One, this is actually like something that happened in the most recent season of Succession. And I would not put it past Elon Musk watching that episode and then being like, yo, if Sarsgaard can do it, I can do it. And then making this happen. And then two, I just want to shout out because, this was a listener submitted question, but there was also kind of like Twitter follower related commentary on this. This is coming from Jeff Fedor, who's the CEO of Backbone. He said, on the Twitter and Elon situation, boards shouldn't be making specific product decisions. That's not their role. I hope good governance will prevail, but I'm worried about the future of Twitter. And I was like, that is the most rational version of my concerns that I've read. But again, he's applying this only from like a traditional business and governance standpoint. And we're not only talking about fucking Twitter, we're talking about Elon Musk. And it's just like, is there anyone in the room even thinking about this the way that Jeff is? Or the way that the businesses used to or supposed to? And I don't think so. And it leads me to despair, Katie. I despair.
I think that's a really interesting and thoughtful point. But are you just interested to see what these improvements might be? If it were to happen, I'm not saying it should, board governance, all that. But isn't your interest piqued? It's not. I just feel like it wouldn't be boring. I'm just putting a hot take out there. That's all I'm saying.
It would be boring, and that's the problem. The guy who is specifically under tweet restrictions from the SEC now owns 10% of Twitter. And that's just where we are in the world.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong?
On to our next submitted question. Okay, so there was a New York Times article that recently came out.
Speaking of shitposting.
And it was titled, Toronto's Tech Industry is Quietly Booming. So the question is, what are your thoughts on this and the quote-unquote quietly booming part?
Well, first of all, I think I can dismiss the quietly booming, the point of the question, which is I don't think there's anything quiet about it. I don't know what it is with Canada and Toronto and whatever, where it's like, Canada, the secret blah, blah, blah. Every few years, one of these fucking articles comes out as though we're like this hidden jewel. And I'm like, really? So anyway, I don't think there's anything quiet about it, although it makes for maybe a good headline. The article is basically expounding on, hey, look, it's a tech hub. There's really smart people here. Sometimes they're a bit cheaper, but holy cow, there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of innovation happening. And the only thing that bugs me a little bit about it, I think, is that it definitely does the highlights. Hey, Shopify's from Canada and they have a Toronto office. Oh, Jeff Hinton, Mr. AI. Like, it hits on all the notes that you'd expect them to hit. It's maybe not the article, but it's the distinction between, I think, Douglas, you always refer to it as Canada, the branch plant economy of the United States. It does mention the fact that, compared to Silicon Valley, which is a stupid metric because nothing's like Silicon Valley, but the capital invested in startups was like $5 billion versus $132 billion in Silicon Valley. But a good chunk of that article focuses on American companies hiring Canadian talent because they are cheaper, just as smart, and so on and so forth, where I think we would want to segment those things out. I don't think we're some sort of secret, like low-cost branch plant thing where we're a bunch of suckers who just work for American companies or foreign nationals, foreign companies. I think there's more to be said about the innovation that's actually happening in the ecosystem of Canada, Toronto being obviously a major part of it. And I think that the confounding of those two things made me a bit sad because I think that they're not the same thing. That was my initial take on it. So I don't think it's quiet. And I don't think confounding branch plant economy with actual innovation and leadership and just always citing Shopify as an example is it just kind of doesn't paint us in the light that I think we really want to be shown to the world as. Again, this is an opinion article, but that's my take.
Rob, you need to start premising every statement with just saying, as a founder.
Yeah, I'm trying not to be that much of an ass.
Meagan, I've already talked shit about one publication today. What were your thoughts on this story?
I think Rob brings up some really good points, and it brings to mind to me, like, that nuance that you're trying to talk about, Rob, is what we try and cover every day on BetaKit, right? Obviously very different, us being a publication focused on that, but that's what we try and suss out, the nuance that's happening. And I think when you have publications or people come in who aren't part of that space on a day-to-day basis, they're gonna miss it. What I find really interesting, though, is kind of to that point of like quietly booming. I feel like that continues, as you're saying, Rob, to be like this narrative that's out there. And the question that comes to my mind is like, why does it keep perpetuating? Canada is at the top of all these lists of like fastest growing tech ecosystem. Like, if you think it's quiet, you've missed it. But it still continues to be out there. And I think sometimes when you talk to people outside of Canada, outside of the Canadian tech bubble, they're not as familiar with what's going on here. And maybe it is quieter outside of Canada is what comes to my mind, right? Like, I don't see how, but it just seems like that idea is perpetuating.
I agree that it's perpetuating, but I also, it contrasts to this with some reporting we recently did on the launch of Canada Ventures, which was literally founded to bring international companies to Canada because the founders in other roles were traveling all around the world and people wanted to talk to them about Canada because they already knew what was going down versus them having to sell it. Meagan, you're right. There's something else going on here. Something Rob said, it kind of reminded me, like, you could see a similar story framing to be like Martha's Vineyard, the quiet retreat for New York City's booming business elite.
Yeah.
Is secretly, quietly booming with financial talent. The framing is coming from outside of the house. And the reason why it doesn't work or doesn't match to fit the reality is because it's coming from people outside of the ecosystem. Rob noted this as well. You have to get 8 paragraphs into the story, 8 paragraphs in a story by the New York Times to have a Canadian-founded company mentioned in the story. It's because the New York Times and international publications don't care about Canadian companies. They care about the global companies that are US-based, expanding to other places and have a keen interest on what they consider to be the clean version of New York City. I get upset when our ecosystem either celebrates these types of stories, disdain them, or even cares, because it's kind of not for us as much as it's not about us. Knowing who all was interviewed for this story, who are not included in the piece, it's pretty clear maybe what the interested narrative was. Now, you can't fit everything into a piece, especially if you only write about Toronto tech once ever. There's going to be a lot on the cutting room floor. But I don't think Cade Metz came to Toronto for this piece. But if he was to stand probably at college and university, let's say if we put him in the Mars Discovery District, he probably could have been within 5 minutes of talking to everyone that was featured in this story. And the U of T Mars AI company branch plant connections here are such that it makes me wonder who initially pitched this story and who was kind of like facilitating some of the intros. Now, I know a lot of other people in the ecosystem were connected to the author of this piece and spoke to them, and they were not included in this piece. I don't know. BetaKit does it better. What can I say? Can't begrudge a publication that does nothing about its subject. Like we just saw all the coverage of what happened in Ottawa when it comes to like the trucker protests and how wrong the New York Times and other US publications got that. Why would we expect them to get a profile on one of our major cities' tech ecosystems accurate when the stakes are so much lower?
I want to sort of amplify Meagan's observation because I think it's a really apt one. I mean, we've had people on this podcast like Chris Albinson who are like champions of the ecosystem writ large. And if the brand that's being sold on beyond our borders is not, I forget the conference, maybe it was South by Southwest, we had a bunch of people dressed up as Mounties. It was just like, what the hell are you doing? So it's like, if the message we're sending out, and this goes back to Senator Deacon's thing, if it's just like, it's stayed and true and solid and nothing really changes here, it's just safe and boring, then that's the message that people hear. So I wonder, to your point, Meagan, is this a marketing problem? Are we selling ourselves incorrectly? Are we being too Canadian, ironically, stereotypically Canadian, that is, about the way we talk about ourselves. And he just sort of tapped into that easy narrative.
No, if it was a marketing problem, we'd be talking about Vancouver, right? That's a dig all for all our Vancouver tech peeps who are just like livid that the feature wasn't about their city.
I don't know if I've ever heard a more evil cackle come out of your mouth, Douglas.
Yeah, that's what the AMAs will do to people. Honestly, I don't think, to your point, Rob, like the Mountie stuff, like we also do that on our own Olympics that we host.
Yeah,
we
that's a
embrace
problem.
that narrative.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it's not an issue, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it doesn't perpetuate to Canadian tech.
I think the real answer here is if we want to be the change we want to see in the world, we need to start shitposting more on Twitter and take an ownership stake in the New York Times, get on their editorial board and direct their coverage. That's what the internet has taught us, right?
So, would you prefer to fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck?
I'm going to answer first because Douglas has a real answer.
I have a real answer, yeah.
One ducking horse.
Rob, that's why I love you, man. First, because you're willing to commit to taking the honestly the shit posting that we receive from our listeners for these podcasts and turn it into content. But I completely agree with you. And I know that this is a dumb question that's asked all across the internet at conferences and festivals. It's just a prompt for whatever. But I have thought about this question for years. And I think, what is the best answer? If I was trying to win, you'd obviously say duck-sized horses because no one fears a horse of that size. I would just be punting those suckers all over the place. No sweat. Might get a little tired, but I'm not in fear of my life. It would just be a lot of work and then a lot of sad punted duck-sized horses all over the place. But if I want to go down in infamy, if I really want to test myself, I'm fighting a horse-sized duck. Ducks are vicious creatures. They're aggressive. If you've ever been feeding them in the park and having them nip at you, you know what they're about. Now imagine a horse-sized duck. That is a battle to remember. It is a true test of will and strength. And, I wouldn't settle for anything less.
Same.
Oh, come on, Meagan.
No, I was just kidding.
She's gonna go verify with 3 sources first before she answers.
I also wanted to say one horse-sized duck for none of the reasons that Douglas said. But then I felt, I'm agreeing with everyone. Maybe I should just go with all of the tiny ones. So let's do that.
Okay, I'm fine with you being contrarian, but now I want to know the different reasons why you wanted to fight a horse-sized duck because I feel less alone in the universe because of that. What were your reasons?
I just felt like it's very large. But ducks also waddle, and it would just be a large waddling duck that I'd be able to run away from faster than a bunch of little ones that would be pecking at me.
Well, little ones would be whinnying and kind of trying to trample you.
Oh yeah, those little
true.
mini
Little horsies.
the little mini horses would just be zooming across town like those kind of barely a dog type animals. So this is a balance thing. You feel like you could kick out one of those legs, topple that duck over, and then make your way about town. I respect it. That's good strategy.
I have a follow-up question. I wonder if your answer will change. On the Canadian front, what if that duck was actually a Canadian goose?
Oh fuck no, we'd all
Yeah,
be
no.
dead. There's no way that anyone would survive. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.